The wind carried the scent of sagebrush across the valley, dry and sharp as the dust that clung to the wooden fences. The old ranch sat quiet under the weight of a golden evening, where the last of the sunlight stretched long shadows over the dirt road. Somewhere in that stillness, a horse snorted, restless from the coming storm that gathered in the far west. The sky had that look again, dark clouds rolling slow and heavy, like they had something to say. Folks in the village said storms brought change. Out here, change wasn't always welcome. The rancher leaned on the fence, hat tilted low, eyes fixed on the horizon where the storm met the desert. He'd worked these lands since before his hair turned gray at the edges, and every inch of soil carried a memory. Some good, most not. He wasn't much for words, and he wasn't much for regrets either. But as the dust began to rise and the sky darkened, there was one regret that gnawed at him more than the rest. Her. She had come into his life quiet as dawn, wrapped in mystery like the morning fog that rolled through the canyons. No one in the village knew much about her, only that she'd arrived from the east on a wagon that looked older than she did. Some said she was running from something. Others said she was searching for something that didn't want to be found. Whatever the truth was, she carried it like a burden, hidden behind those calm eyes and the faint tremor in her voice whenever someone asked too much. The first time he'd seen her, she was standing by the old well outside the mercantile, drawing water with a strength that didn't fit her frame. He tipped his hat, trying not to stare too long, but something about her stopped him cold. Maybe it was the way she looked at him. Not shy, not bold, just steady. Like she already knew something he didn't. Like she was measuring whether he'd make a mistake. He had, of course. The mistake of walking away. For weeks he'd told himself it was better that way. The ranch had its demands, the land its temper. A man like him didn't have time for trouble wearing a pretty face, but trouble had a way of finding him anyway. The drought that year had bitten hard, the cattle were thinning, and debts were climbing faster than he could pay them down. Yet every time he passed through the village, he caught sight of her, buying supplies, feeding strays behind the blacksmiths, sometimes sitting by the church steps at dusk, eyes turned toward the hills like she was listening for something. One evening, after too many days of silence, he found her again. The saloon lights were dim, smoke hanging thick in the air. A few locals watched as she walked past the tables, her boots echoing on the wooden floor. She didn't belong in that kind of place, but neither did he. When their eyes met, there was no smile, just a quiet recognition of what had been avoided too long. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough from dust and whiskey. She looked at him, a flicker of defiance crossing her face. "And you should?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew they were out of place, two stubborn souls pretending they weren't drawn to the same fire. Outside, the wind picked up, sending shutters clattering and lanterns swaying. They stepped out together, the night cool and tense, filled with the scent of rain. The village was empty, save for a stray dog trotting down the main road. She stopped beneath the old elm tree near the churchyard, the moonlight catching strands of her hair as she turned toward him. "You'll regret choosing me," she whispered. The rancher studied her, every word sinking deep like the edge of a blade. Then after a long pause, he smiled, slow and weary, the kind that came from a man who'd seen too much and still wasn't scared of losing more. "I already regret waiting this long." Her breath caught, but she didn't step closer. Not yet. The air between them seemed to thicken with everything unspoken. The pain, the fear, the kind of longing that people in small towns pretend doesn't exist. The rancher could hear the rumble of thunder rolling closer, but his eyes stayed fixed on her. "Whatever it is you're running from," he said quietly, "you don't have to keep running." Her gaze flickered, something fragile breaking through the calm she'd worn like armor. "And what if I'm not running?" she asked. "What if I'm the one bringing the trouble?" He didn't flinch. "Then I'll deal with it when it comes." The storm cracked open then, lightning tearing the sky wide. She turned toward the sound, and for a moment, her face looked haunted, illuminated by the white flash that showed every hidden fear she'd tried to bury. She pulled her shawl tighter, but her hands trembled. He took a slow step toward her, not sure if she'd let him get close. "You're not the only one with ghosts," he said softly. Her eyes met his again, and for the first time he saw tears glinting there. "You don't understand," she whispered. "If they find me, everyone here will pay the price." The words hung heavy between them, caught in the hum of the storm. He frowned, his jaw tightening. "Who?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "It doesn't matter. They won't stop until I'm gone. You'd be wise to forget I ever came here, but he couldn't, not now. not after waiting all this time. He stepped closer, close enough to see the fear behind her calm. "You think I scare easy?" "No," she said quietly, almost sadly. "That's what worries me." Another flash of lightning lit up the valley, and thunder rolled so loud it made the ground shake. The first drops of rain began to fall, tapping softly on the wooden steps of the church. She turned as if to leave, but he caught her wrist gently, his voice low and certain. "Then let me regret something worth regretting." For a moment, she just stared at him, the rain beginning to soak through her shawl. Her lips parted like she wanted to speak, but the words never came. Somewhere in the distance, a horse cried out, startled by the thunder. Then gunshots. 3 sharp cracks echoed from the ridge beyond the village. She froze. Her eyes widened in terror. "They found me," she whispered. Before he could ask another question, she pulled free from his hand and ran into the darkness, her boots splashing through the mud as the rain came harder. He shouted her name, but the wind swallowed his voice. The thunder roared again, louder now, and he could hear horses on the ridge, riders moving fast. The rancher stood there in the storm, heart pounding, every instinct in him screaming that this was no ordinary night. The woman who had warned him was gone, the shadows alive with movement, and the storm was just beginning. He looked toward the hills, lightning flashing across the horizon, revealing dark figures riding down the slope. He adjusted his hat, wiped the rain from his face, and muttered under his breath, "Guess I should have regretted something sooner." Then he turned toward the barn, where his rifle hung above the door, the wind howling through the valley like a warning he was too stubborn to heed. The storm raged harder, the thunder chasing him all the way back to the ranch. Behind him, in the distance, a woman's voice carried faintly through the rain. It was barely more than a whisper, but he heard it, and it froze him where he stood. "You should have listened." The next lightning strike lit the valley white, and the sound of hooves came thundering through the darkness. The storm howled through the night, drenching the land that had begged for rain for months. The wind tore at the rancher's coat as he pushed open the barn door, the hinges creaking like a groan from an old wound. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet hay and horse sweat. His gelding snorted and stamped, uneasy from the thunder that rolled over the valley like cannon fire. He took down his rifle from the wall, checked the chamber, then looked out through the open door toward the dark ridge where the shots had come from. Lightning split the sky again, and for a blink, he saw movement along the slope, 3, maybe 4 riders, cutting across the ridge like shadows on the hunt. He felt his jaw tighten. Whoever they weren't travelers seeking shelter. Their timing was too sharp, their direction too sure. They'd come for her, and somehow they'd found her. He saddled his horse in silence, the rain slapping the roof in wild rhythm. Every motion was steady, practiced. The man had spent most of his life in storms, weathered by them, shaped by them. He didn't run from danger. He faced it until it was gone, or he was. That was the way of men raised out here, where justice was a thing you carried in your hands, not something written down in some courthouse miles away. When he rode out into the storm, the wind hit him like a wall. The road was mud, the lightning too close for comfort, but he pressed on. He followed the faint trail of footprints she'd left, small, quick, barely visible between the puddles. She was headed toward the hills north of the village, the wild country where the rocks rose high and the brush was thick enough to hide a ghost. He remembered her words echoing through the rain. You should have listened. Maybe she'd been right. Maybe he should have turned away while he still could. But he'd already waited too long for something real, something worth risking a quiet life for. And now, there was no going back. As he rode through the dark, flashes of the past came to him. He'd once been a younger man with more to lose. His father's ranch, a family name worth something, and a woman who'd promised forever. But forever hadn't lasted through the drought years, when the land gave nothing and folks started selling off pieces of their souls to survive. By the time he'd learned how to stand alone, the world around him had turned hard and mean. That's when he stopped waiting for anyone to stay. But she wasn't like the others. There was something in her eyes that spoke of survival, the same kind he'd known in himself. A quiet defiance, a strength that came from walking through fire and still breathing. When she warned him he'd regret choosing her, he'd thought she meant heartbreak. Now he wondered if she'd meant blood. The rain eased a little as he reached the outskirts of the village. The lamps in the saloon were out, and most of the town lay dark except for the faint glow from the sheriff's office. He reined in his horse near the stable, scanning the street. Then he saw it, hoof prints fresh and deep cutting toward the trail leading into the canyon. She was still ahead of him, and the riders were closing in. He kicked his horse into motion, following the narrow path through the brush. The air smelled of wet cedar and gunpowder. The ground was slick, but his horse knew the land well. The storm had moved east now, rumbling faintly like a memory fading into the distance. The moon broke through the clouds just enough to light the trail. That's when he saw her. She was kneeling beside a fallen log, her shawl soaked, hair clinging to her face, breathing hard. When she turned, her eyes met his with a mix of relief and dread. "You shouldn't have followed me," she said. "Wasn't about choice," he replied, dismounting. "You're being hunted. I don't leave folks to die on my land." She looked down at the mud, her voice shaking. "They'll kill anyone who gets in their way. Then they'll have to try." He offered her his hand, but she hesitated. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief light, he saw the edge of something metallic under her coat. A pistol, old, but cared for. She wasn't helpless. She'd been ready to fight. They moved together toward a cluster of rocks where the path narrowed into a ridge. The air was heavy with the sound of distant hooves. She stopped suddenly and turned to him. "I didn't come here by chance," she said. "This place..." It was supposed to be safe, but they always find me, he frowned. "Who are they?" Her voice was barely above the rain. "Men who wear law badges when it suits them. Bounty riders when it doesn't." He froze, realizing what she was saying. "You're wanted?" "Not for what they say," she whispered. "But they'll make sure no one hears my side." He studied her face in the dim light. There was no deceit there, just exhaustion and fear. He didn't know what crime she'd been accused of, but he knew the look of someone cornered by the world. "Whatever you did or didn't do," he said quietly, "you don't deserve to die for it." A gunshot cracked the night, close enough to make the rocks echo. They ducked behind a ledge as a bullet sparked off the stone beside them. His horse bolted, disappearing into the trees. "They're here," she whispered. He loaded his rifle and peered through the dark. He could make out faint shapes moving through the trees below. 3 riders fanning out, rifles glinting in the moonlight. He turned to her. "Stay behind me," she shook her head. "They won't stop with you. I know what they're after. Then tell me." Her eyes filled with something like regret. A name, a secret buried in the dirt of this valley. One they'll kill to keep hidden. Before he could ask more, the riders opened fire. Splinters flew from the rocks, and the air filled with gun smoke and thunder. He fired back, his rifle echoing down the canyon, the smell of powder thick in the rain-soaked air. One rider fell, the others scattering behind the trees. When the gunfire paused, he grabbed her hand and pulled her deeper into the rocks. "There's an old miner's shack up ahead. We'll hole up there till morning." She nodded, breathless, and they climbed the steep trail, slipping on the wet stones. The moonlight guided them to the edge of a ravine where the shack stood, half collapsed, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Inside, it smelled of rot and old smoke, but it was shelter. He pushed a crate against the door and lit a small lantern from his pack. The dim light painted her face in gold and shadow. She looked around the small room like she'd been here before. "You know this place," he said. "My father worked these hills once," she murmured. "Before they killed him." The word struck him harder than the wind outside. "Who?" She stared at the floor. "The same men chasing us now. They called it an accident in the mines. Said it was his fault, but he'd found something. Proof that the company had been lying about their claims. He tried to take it to the papers. Then he disappeared. I was 15 when they came for me. I ran and never stopped." He sank onto the crate, his mind turning over her words. The mining company had long been the power behind this valley, owning half the land and controlling the rest through debt. If her father had found something that could ruin them, that would explain everything. "You've been hiding ever since," he said quietly. She nodded. "And every time I thought I was safe, someone new showed up with the same question. Where's the ledger?" "The ledger? It's what my father kept. Names, payments, land deeds, everything they stole. If they get it back, no one will ever prove what happened." He leaned forward, his voice low. "And you know where it is?" Her eyes lifted to his, full of fear and fire both. "Yes, and so do they." The sound of hooves echoed faintly outside. Both turned toward the window. Lantern light flickered in the trees, riders circling the ridge again. He put out the lantern, plunging them into darkness. "We can't stay here. They'll find us no matter where we go," she whispered. "Then we make sure they don't." The rain started again, softer now, almost gentle. He checked his rifle, then looked back at her. "You said your father worked these mines. Did he ever tell you about the escape shafts?" Her eyes widened. "There's one behind the coal bin. They moved fast, shifting the heavy wood aside to reveal a narrow tunnel leading into the darkness. She hesitated only a second before crawling in, and he followed close behind. The passage was damp and cold, the air thick with earth. They could hear the muffled voices of the riders above, searching, calling out orders. He reached back, sliding the entrance cover shut, sealing them in darkness. "We'll wait till dawn," he whispered. "Then we'll move," she nodded, her voice trembling. "They'll never stop. Not till they have it." He glanced at her silhouette in the faint glimmer of moonlight seeping through a crack above. Then maybe it's time someone did stop them. The earth trembled faintly as thunder rolled again in the distance. The tunnel stretched ahead, endless and black, the kind of darkness that hid both salvation and danger. Somewhere outside, horses neighed, men shouted, and the storm gathered once more. Neither spoke again, but the silence between them carried a promise, the kind made not with words, but with resolve, the kind that would change everything come morning. The tunnel stretched deep under the hill, cold air brushing their faces as they crawled forward in silence. The narrow walls scraped at their clothes, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. Every few feet the rancher stopped to listen, his ear close to the ground. He could hear faint movements above, horses, boots, maybe a voice or two, but it was hard to tell through the layers of dirt and stone. The woman followed close behind, her breathing steady though her hands trembled slightly in the dark. She'd been running a long time, but tonight was different. Tonight she wasn't alone. After what felt like an hour, the tunnel opened into a wider shaft, where old support beams leaned like tired men. A rusted lantern hung from a nail half buried in cobwebs. The rancher picked it up, brushed it clean, and lit it with a match. The weak flame flickered to life, casting light over old mining tools, a broken wheelbarrow, and the faint outlines of cart tracks leading deeper into the earth. "This place hasn't been touched in years," he said quietly. She nodded, looking around like the ghosts of memory were walking beside her. "My father used to bring me here. Said the mine was cursed after the flood, that the company sealed it off and left men inside. He never believed it was an accident." He ran his hand along one of the support beams. "Floods don't happen in dry country without someone's hand behind it." "That's what he said," she whispered. He kept digging for truth until it buried him instead. The flickering light revealed more of the passage. Collapsed tunnels, twisted rails, tools left in a hurry. It wasn't hard to imagine what had happened. Greedy men, cheap timber, and a rush for silver that made them forget the worth of life. Somewhere in these walls, lies had been buried deeper than ore. They kept walking until the tunnel curved sharply to the right and opened into a chamber supported by rotted beams. A few old crates sat in the corner, marked with faded lettering. The woman brushed dust from one and traced the letters with her fingers. "Marin Mining Company," she said softly. "Same name that owned half this valley." The rancher leaned against the wall, eyes narrowed. "That's the same name stamped on every foreclosure deed I've ever signed. They took 3 ranches last winter alone." She looked up at him, her eyes catching the lantern light. "Now you see why they can't let this surface." He didn't answer. His mind was racing through the years. Neighbors forced off their land, wells drying overnight, men disappearing after questioning contracts. None of it ever made sense, but the company always came out clean, the law always on their side. Now, for the first time, the pieces began to fit. She knelt beside a crate and pried it open with a rusted crowbar. Inside, beneath layers of canvas and dirt, lay stacks of old ledgers, most water-damaged, but one near the top still intact. She opened it carefully, the pages yellow and fragile, ink faded but legible. Numbers, signatures, and payments filled each page. Names of ranchers, miners, and men he'd known all his life. Her voice broke slightly as she spoke. "My father hid the real ledger before they could take it. He made copies to lead them off his trail. I think these are the decoys. And the real one?" he asked. She closed the book and looked toward the far wall where a narrow crack ran from floor to ceiling. "He said it was buried where the earth bleeds red." He frowned. "You mean the canyon?" She nodded. "The Red Hollow. But that's 2 days' ride, maybe more if they're still out there." He thought of the men hunting them, the ones who fired without warning. They weren't bounty riders, they were enforcers, the kind the company used to erase mistakes. "If we head for the hollow, we'll need supplies and fresh horses. They'll expect us to run, not circle back." She gave a faint, humorless smile. "You sound like you've done this before." He met her eyes. "Out here, every man's had to run from something." The lantern sputtered, its light dimming. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the drip of water somewhere deep in the mine. The woman wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, shivering. He moved closer, not touching her but close enough to share warmth from his coat. "You ever think of leaving this place?" she asked softly. "Plenty of times," he said. "But the land don't let go easy. Every fence post, every hoof print, it's part of who I am. Maybe it's foolish, but I'd rather fight for it than run." She looked at him then, really looked, like she was seeing the man beneath the dirt and wear. "That's what they count on," she said quietly. "Good men staying put while bad ones move faster." He didn't have an answer for that. The truth of it hit too deep. He'd spent years fighting drought, rustlers, and debt, never realizing the biggest enemy was wearing fine boots and signing papers in town. A noise echoed down the tunnel, a distant metallic clang. They both froze. The woman's hand went to her pistol, and he doused the lantern in one motion. The darkness returned, thick as smoke. They listened. Another sound, hooves, faint but getting closer. "They found the shaft," he murmured. "How?" He didn't reply. He already knew. Someone in the village must have talked. Maybe the blacksmith who saw them leave. Maybe the sheriff who owed favors to the company. Out here, loyalty often bent under the weight of gold. He motioned for her to follow, and they moved deeper into the mine. The path sloped down, water seeping under their boots. The air grew colder, thinner. Ahead, the tunnel forked. One side caved in, the other leading into darkness that seemed endless. He chose the right-hand path, guiding her by touch. They moved fast but quiet, stopping every few steps to listen. Voices echoed faintly behind them now, men calling, searching, their lanterns glowing like fireflies in the distance. The rancher knew they couldn't outrun them forever. The mine was a maze, and one wrong turn could bury them both. After a long stretch, the tunnel widened again into what looked like an old loading area. Rusted rails curved toward a lift shaft, its rope frayed and pulley rusted solid. Beside it lay an overturned cart half buried in gravel. He checked his rifle, only a few rounds left. "We'll rest here for a moment," he said. She sank onto a beam, brushing hair from her face. "They won't stop, will they?" "No," he said simply, "but they'll be careful in the mine. Too easy to bring the whole place down on themselves." Her eyes searched his face. "You've done this kind of thing before, haven't you?" "Not this exactly," he said, "but I've had to protect what's mine." "And am I part of that now?" He hesitated. "Seems like it." Her gaze softened for a moment, then hardened again. "Then you should know. If we find that ledger, it won't just be your fight anymore. It'll be every man's who ever lost land to them." He nodded slowly. "That's a fight worth having." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the drip of water and the distant rumble of thunder above ground. She finally leaned back, her voice quieter. "My father used to say the truth's like gold. It shines brighter the deeper you bury it. I never understood what he meant until now." He looked down the dark shaft ahead, his gut tight with unease. Sometimes digging it out costs more than it's worth. Before she could answer, another sound cut through the silence. A low, creaking groan that sent a shiver through the ground. Dust fell from the ceiling and a beam cracked. The rancher grabbed her arm and pulled her back as the tunnel shook violently. "Get down!" he shouted. A section of the roof gave way, collapsing where they'd been standing seconds before. The mine filled with dust, the air thick and choking. When it settled, the way they'd come was gone, sealed under rock and debris. She coughed, wiping her eyes. "We're trapped." "Not yet," he said, helping her up. "There's always another way out." He raised the lantern again and scanned the chamber. On the far wall, half hidden by debris, was a wooden door, half rotted but still intact. He forced it open with his shoulder. Behind it, a narrow passage sloped upward, faint air flowing through. She met his eyes, her voice unsteady. "You really think it leads out?" "Only one way to find out." They started climbing again, one careful step after another. The passage twisted and narrowed, the air growing colder. Somewhere ahead, faint light filtered through the cracks in the stone. Hope flickered, fragile but alive. Then, just as they neared the top, a voice echoed behind them. Harsh, commanding, too close. "Don't move! We've got you surrounded." The rancher froze, hand tightening around the rifle. The woman turned, her face pale in the half-light. He looked at her once, steady and calm despite the fear clawing at both of them. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "don't lose that ledger. It's worth more than both our lives." Before she could reply, a shot rang out, the sound exploding through the tunnel like thunder in the earth. The lantern shattered, plunging them into darkness once again, the smell of smoke and dust filling their lungs. And in that darkness, she heard him whisper, low, certain, unafraid. "We're not done yet." The sound of the gunshot echoed through the tunnel like thunder trapped in stone. The air filled with dust and the sharp scent of gunpowder. The woman dropped low beside the rancher, clutching the ledger tight to her chest as bits of rock tumbled from the ceiling. For a heartbeat, there was only silence, broken by the faint hiss of smoke curling from the shattered lantern glass. Then came the voices, men shouting orders from deeper down, their boots striking the ground in a rhythm that grew faster with every echo. The rancher's hand found her shoulder, steadying her. "Keep quiet," he whispered. "They're close." She nodded, her breath trembling, and the two of them began to move through the darkness, step by step, following the faint whisper of air that hinted at an exit. The tunnel sloped upward, twisting and narrow, the walls slick with moisture. Behind them, the voices grew louder, closer now. One man laughed, another cursed, and the metallic click of a revolver being cocked cut through the air. "They're hunting us like dogs," she whispered. "Then we'll make 'em earn their pay," the rancher muttered, tightening his grip on the rifle. His voice was calm, but she could hear something underneath, a tension like a drawn bowstring ready to snap. The tunnel widened suddenly into an old cavern where wooden beams stretched like ribs across the ceiling. In the center lay an old mining cart half buried in gravel. He gestured for her to get behind it. "Stay low. They'll have lanterns. When they come in, I'll draw their fire." She shook her head. "You can't fight them all." "I ain't planning to," he said softly. "Just enough to buy us time." The first glow of light appeared down the passage, a lantern swinging in a rough hand. Voices followed, rough and familiar. The rancher recognized the tone. Men who'd done dirty work before. The kind who smiled while doing it, spread out, one called. "She's worth more alive, but the boss don't mind dead if it comes to that." The rancher's jaw tightened. He raised the rifle and waited. As the first figure stepped into the open, he fired once. The shot cracked like lightning and the man dropped, his lantern tumbling to the floor and shattering in a flare of light. Shadows danced wild across the cavern walls. The others shouted, guns blazing, bullets striking stone, sending sparks in every direction. The woman ducked behind the cart, covering her ears as dust rained from the ceiling. She could hear his voice through the chaos, sharp, commanding, fearless. "Move, don't stop." She crawled toward the far wall where a narrow fissure ran upward, the faintest trace of moonlight seeping through. "Here," she cried. "This way!" He fired 2 more shots before diving beside her. Together they squeezed through the narrow opening, scraping their hands and clothes on jagged rock. Outside, cold air rushed against their faces, a shock after the heavy air of the mine. They stumbled out onto a steep hillside covered in scrub and shale. The valley below stretched wide and dark, lit only by the glow of the storm that still flashed faintly on the horizon. "Go," he said, catching her hand. They ran down the slope, slipping on wet stones, their shadows leaping in the flashes of lightning. Behind them, the gunmen burst from the tunnel, shouting curses as they fired blindly into the night. Bullets hissed past, striking the rocks near their feet. The rancher turned and fired back once, then again, buying a few precious seconds. He knew they couldn't outrun them forever. The horses were still back near the ridge, and the riders would have the advantage once they regrouped. But he wasn't about to give up. They reached a narrow ravine where a stream ran through, swollen from the rain. The water shimmered faintly under the moonlight. He led her across, boots splashing, and climbed the opposite side, ducking behind a cluster of boulders. They crouched low, listening. The shouts were farther now, muffled by the wind, but he knew it wouldn't last. She leaned against the rock, clutching the ledger to her chest. "You should have left me," she whispered. "You could have walked away." He shook his head. "I've walked away from too many things that mattered." "Not this time." Her eyes softened, but before she could speak, the distant crack of a rifle echoed through the canyon. The bullet struck the rock beside them, spraying shards of stone. She gasped and ducked lower. "They've got rifles," he said grimly. "We can't stay here." He scanned the terrain. Ahead, the land sloped upward toward a line of cliffs. If they could reach the ridge, they might find shelter among the caves that dotted the high ground. "We head for the cliffs. Keep low and stay close." They moved again, crouched and silent, following the stream until it narrowed into a rocky path. The climb was steep, the ground slick, and more than once she stumbled, but he caught her each time, his hand steady even as his breath came hard. The night was alive with sound, the rustle of brush, the creak of saddles somewhere far behind, and the distant thunder rolling like a warning. Halfway up the slope, they reached a ledge wide enough to rest. From there, the whole valley spread beneath them, silver in the moonlight. Smoke still rose from the mine entrance below, the fire from the broken lantern burning dimly. She looked down, her face pale. They won't stop till they have it. He followed her gaze to the ledger in her hands. What's in there that's worth this kind of trouble? Names, she said quietly. Payments. Every bribe, every death they covered. Enough to burn that company to the ground. He stared at her, realizing the weight she carried wasn't just paper. It was the truth buried under years of lies. Then we make sure it sees daylight. Before she could answer, a voice echoed up the slope. Rough, taunting. No use running, sweetheart. You can't hide forever. They froze. Another voice answered, closer this time. The boss wants the book. Bring her down alive if you can. Shoot the cowboy if you have to. The rancher's eyes met hers, steady and calm. Keep moving. Don't stop for anything. What about you? I'll hold him off. No, she said, gripping his arm. Not alone, he gave a faint smile. I'm not alone. You're the reason I'm still here. The words hit her harder than the wind. For a moment she saw the man not as a fighter or rancher, but as someone who'd carried his own share of loss, someone who'd found something worth risking for again. He turned toward the ridge, checking his rifle. Go, I'll catch up, but she didn't move. The gunfire came again, closer now. He fired back, forcing the riders to take cover. The echo bounced through the canyon, the sharp crack of bullets mixing with the growl of thunder. She finally ran, clutching the ledger, her heart pounding with every step. The climb seemed endless, the air thin and sharp. Behind her the shots continued, echoing higher and higher up the slope. She wanted to look back, but fear pushed her forward. At the top, the ground leveled out into a plateau scattered with boulders and dry grass. She turned, searching the darkness below, desperate for a sign of him. Lightning split the sky, and for a heartbeat she saw him, standing on the ridge, rifle raised, firing at the advancing riders. His silhouette burned against the flash of light, strong and steady. Then the darkness swallowed him again. Come on, she whispered, her voice breaking. Another gunshot, then silence. She pressed herself against the rock, clutching the ledger so tight it hurt. The wind howled around her, carrying the smell of rain and smoke. Down below, faint voices called out, but she couldn't make out the words. Then, a figure appeared at the edge of the ridge, climbing toward her. For a moment, hope flickered, but as the man stepped into the moonlight, she saw it wasn't him. It was one of the riders, a tall man with a scar across his cheek and a smirk that made her blood run cold. Evening, miss, he drawled, gun gleaming in his hand. You've led us on quite the chase. She backed away slowly, heart pounding. You'll have to kill me to get it. He laughed, low and cruel. That can be arranged. Before he could step closer, a shadow moved behind him. The rancher. His face was streaked with dirt and blood, his hat gone, but his eyes were sharp as ever. He raised his rifle and said, calm as a church bell. Don't. The rider turned just as the wind howled through the canyon again. The two men locked eyes, both knowing only one would walk away. The woman stood frozen between them, the ledger clutched to her chest, the storm breaking over the valley once more. Lightning lit the sky in a blinding flash, and thunder followed like the roar of the earth itself. The wind tore across the plateau, carrying the smell of rain and iron. Neither man moved. And then the world exploded into motion. The sound of the gunshot split the air, echoing across the cliffs until it was swallowed by the storm. For a moment everything went still. The rain slowed, the wind fell quiet, and the world held its breath. The rider stumbled backward, eyes wide, before dropping to the ground. His revolver slipped from his hand and tumbled into the ravine below. Smoke curled from the rancher's rifle, his chest heaving as he lowered it slowly. The woman stood frozen, clutching the ledger against her heart. The fight was over, or so it seemed. But down below, the other riders shouted in alarm. Lanterns flickered in the valley as they scrambled to regroup. The rancher turned to her, voice low but firm. We've got to move. They'll be coming. She nodded, still shaken, and followed as he led her along the ridge toward the shelter of the rocks. The rain picked up again, soft at first, then steady, washing away the dust and the blood. Each step felt heavier, the weight of everything catching up to them. They found a shallow cave near the ridgeline, barely enough room for the two of them, but it was dry and hidden from view. The rancher set down his rifle and leaned back against the stone, exhaustion settling into his bones. She knelt beside him, her eyes searching his face. You're hurt, she said quietly, noticing the dark patch on his shoulder. Just a graze, he replied, though his voice faltered. I've had worse. She tore a strip from her shawl and pressed it against the wound. He didn't flinch. For a long time neither spoke. The only sound was the rain drumming on the rocks outside and the soft crackle of thunder rolling away. Finally, she broke the silence. You could have left me. You should have. He looked at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. And spend the rest of my life wondering if you made it out alive? I reckon I've got enough regrets. She laughed softly, though it trembled. You said you already regretted waiting this long. He nodded. Still do. Something in his tone made her heart ache. The world outside might have been falling apart, but in that cave for a brief moment, everything felt still. He looked at her the way a man does when he's finally stopped running from what he feels. And though she'd spent years hiding, she couldn't hide from that. When morning came, the storm had passed. The valley below shimmered under a pale light, clean and new. Smoke no longer rose from the mine. Only silence lay over the land. The riders were gone, or buried under the mountain they'd stirred up. Either way, the chase was over. The rancher stood at the mouth of the cave, his shirt torn, the wound bandaged clumsily. The sun hit the wet stones, turning them gold. We'll ride for the hollow, he said. If your father hid the real ledger there, it's time it saw daylight. She looked down at the book in her hands, the false ledger that had nearly cost both their lives. What happens after? She asked. He turned, eyes steady. Then we finish what he started. They rode through the day, following the trail east where the land turned red and dry again. The storm had left the air cool and sweet, and for the first time in days, the sky was clear. The red hollow wasn't far now, just beyond a stretch of mesas and canyons that seemed to breathe with history. Every step of the horses echoed off the cliffs, the sound lonely but alive. By late afternoon, they reached it. The hollow was a deep cut in the land, carved by time and wind, surrounded by crimson rock that glowed under the sun. At the center stood an old cottonwood tree, its roots twisting deep into the earth. The rancher dismounted first, scanning the area with practiced eyes. Nothing moved but the wind. This is the place, she whispered, sliding down from her horse. She walked to the tree, her hands brushing over the bark as though greeting an old friend. He said the truth would rest where the earth bleeds red. He must have meant here. They searched around the roots until she found a spot where the dirt had been turned long ago. Together, they dug with their hands, pulling away stones and roots until something solid touched her fingers. She gasped softly and uncovered a small tin box, rusted but intact. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a second ledger. This one was heavier, the pages bound in thick leather, every line written in her father's careful hand. She opened it slowly. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. Names, deeds, payments, signatures. Proof. Tears welled in her eyes as she traced her father's writing. He kept his promise, she whispered. He didn't die for nothing. The rancher stood beside her, looking over the pages. This'll ruin them, he said. Every man that's lost his land will have a claim again. The company'll fall apart before it can bury this. She closed the book and looked up at him. And what about us? He hesitated, glancing at the horizon. Us? She smiled faintly. When this is done, when the truth comes out, what then? He looked out over the red valley, his hat tilted against the sun. Then maybe I'll stop waiting, he said. Maybe I'll finally build something that lasts. She stepped closer, her voice soft but certain. Maybe you already have. They stayed there until sunset, the sky turning shades of gold and crimson that matched the earth beneath their feet. The wind carried the scent of sage again, and somewhere far off a hawk cried. For the first time the woman felt free, not from fear or from the men who hunted her, but from the weight of running. The truth was no longer buried. When they returned to the village days later, word of the company's downfall had already begun to spread. The sheriff, once silent under their thumb, met them in the street with guilt in his eyes. There's talk in town, he said quietly. They say the mining men fled east, left their papers behind. The rancher handed him the ledger. Make sure the right folks see it. The sheriff took it with a slow nod. You've done more for this valley than the law ever did. As they walked back toward the ranch, the woman looked around at the people gathering in the streets, faces filled with curiosity, hope, and fear. Change was coming, and for once it didn't feel like a curse. The ranch had suffered during the storms, fences broken, fields flooded, but it still stood strong. The woman helped him fix the gate while the sun set behind the hills, painting the land in warm light. You ever think about leaving? She asked quietly. He hammered the last nail, then looked up at her. Not anymore, she smiled. Good, because I'm tired of running, he chuckled, wiping sweat from his brow. Then maybe it's time we both stop. That night, as the crickets sang and the stars returned over the valley, the rancher sat on the porch, his hat resting on his knee. The woman joined him, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It felt like peace. You ever wonder if your father can see all this? He asked finally. She looked up at the sky, the stars bright as lanterns in the dark. I think he can. And I think he'd forgive me for taking so long to finish what he started. He nodded slowly. He'd be proud. She leaned against him, her voice barely above a whisper. So would I. The night air carried the scent of rain again, faint but clean. The ranch stretched before them, quiet and endless. The fences standing firm against the wind. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called, and the sound echoed across the plains like a song for the living. The rancher turned toward her, his voice low and certain. You said I'd regret choosing you, she smiled softly, eyes glinting in the starlight. And do you? He reached for her hand, his rough fingers brushing against hers. Only that I waited this long. The wind stirred the grass, the stars burned brighter, and the land seemed to breathe again. Alive, honest, unburdened. And in that quiet night, where the past finally found its peace, they sat side by side. Two souls who'd stopped running and found home at last.